We're going to pick up in Genesis 45. That's where we're going to start, 45. Now, the boys have already been to Egypt once for food and gone back. And, of course, they played the trick on them with their money. And they kept Simeon in Egypt as a hostage. And they've come back with the second trip to get more, and Dad has allowed them to bring Benjamin. So Joseph plays another trick and puts a little silver cup in Benjamin's sack. They pursue them, stop them, and bring them back to Egypt. So they've been caught with the silver cup, and Judah has made the statement, whoever has that cup, kill him, and the rest of us will be your slaves. And that's kind of how 44 ends. In 45 we pick up where Judah has made a statement in right at the end of 44 to Joseph, I'll sacrifice my life if you'll let Benjamin go home to Daddy. And of course, Joseph knows that Benjamin's the one that wanted to, Benjamin knows, Joseph knows, I'm getting confused. Joseph knows that Judah was initially the one that wanted to kill him. And Reuben stepped in and said, let's just throw him in this well and we'll figure out what to do, but don't kill him. And Joseph remembers that. It's been 20 plus years, but Joseph's not stupid. He remembers that. And now Judah is willing to give his life, kill me, put me in jail, make me a slave, whatever you want to do. Just please, please, let Benjamin go home to Dad. And that scene rocks Joseph. And we pick up in verse 1. Joseph could not control himself any longer. His emotions got the best of him. And verse 1 says, he made himself known to his brothers. My question is, put yourself in those brothers' position right then. What do you think was going through their minds when Joseph said, I'm your brother Joseph? Yeah, they've cleaned me up and shaved me, and I got these fancy clothes, but I'm the guy that you threw in the well and then sold as a slave. And now I'm the number 2 man in Egypt. Basically the number 2 most powerful man on the face of the planet. What do you think those boys was thinking? Those boys, they're in their 40s by now. So what do you think those men were thinking? Were they scared? Surely they could, once he told them, surely they could recognize him. Because he's mentioning things that nobody would know but Joseph. Do you think they're relieved? Wow, I'm glad you're not dead. We've been worrying about you for 20 years. Of course, that'd be a lie. Do you think the first thought that went through their mind was, oh no, now Dad's going to find out what we did? And what's Dad going to do to us? And at that very moment, Joseph had the power to do anything he wanted to those brothers. He could have them put in prison. He could have made them slaves. Or he could have killed them. He had that much power. And I think them boys was shaking in their boots. Sandals. Verse 15 says, Joseph kissed his brothers and wept on them. That's what Joseph did. He hugged them boys and kissed them and cried. He was so emotional. And then it says in verse 15, after that, his brothers talked with him. After that, his brothers talked to him. What in the world do you think they talked about? I'm thinking Joseph is asking, how's Dad? What's been going on? Tell me about your families. And I think them boys are still hung up on, please forgive us. We were kids. We were mad. We were jealous. They're making excuses for what they've done, hoping that Joseph will forgive them. And Joseph is past that. That's in the past to Joseph. He's living in the moment. And he wants to know how his daddy is. I think the boys were wondering, how in the world did you go from that little 17-year-old boy that we sold to those slave traders? How did you get from there to where you are today? Because they knew from those previous visits that Joseph was a very powerful man. And he had a lot of authority. And they're probably wondering, how in the world could you get from that slave trader to where you are today? I think that's the things they talked about. And I think they said, hey, do we really have to tell Daddy what happened? I mean, what would you say? Do we really have to tell him the truth? That we sold you to slave traders and tore your pretty coat up and killed a goat and made all that up? And we hurt you so bad. Do we really have to tell Daddy that? Sure they do. But not at that moment. At that moment, they're scared to death that he's going to kill them. And we'll talk about that some more in a minute. Real quickly, we're going to kind of jump through the next couple of chapters. And as the quarter progresses, we're going to come back. Basically, we're going to start over next week. We're going to come back and kind of focus in on certain events. But like last week, this is kind of an overview. In chapter 46, Joseph sends them home. Go get Daddy, get your wives, get your kids, get everything you got, and come back to Egypt. And we're going to take care of you. I'm going to get you a place to live. We're going to find something for you to do. Because if you stay over there, everybody's going to starve to death. So 46 is them going back to Egypt, gathering everybody up, and coming back. What do you think it was like when they got back and Jacob walks up to Joseph? What do you think that felt like? Especially for Jacob, who for 20 plus years has thought his precious little boy was killed by an animal. And now he finds out that he's alive. I'm thinking Jacob doesn't care what happened. He's just glad he's alive. You think of the scene of the prodigal son. When the boy comes back and Dad runs out there and grabs him and hugs him, does he start asking him what he's been doing while he's gone? No. And I don't think Jacob cares what the past 20 years is like. He's just glad Joseph is alive. There's too many J names in this thing. I think he's just glad my boy's alive. And the words in the parable of the prodigal son says, the father says, for my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and now he's found. And then those next words, and they celebrated. Now, I bet that was some special moment. Chapter 47, it talks about the job that Joseph was given to take care of distributing all the grain. I mean, they saved all this grain for 7 years. Now we're a couple of years into the famine, and food is scarce. And the guy that's got the food is kind of like the golden rule. The people with the gold make the rules. The people with the bread had the power, and that was Joseph. And that chapter deals with how Joseph handled distributing that grain. And Joseph was a fair man. He did a good job, and he didn't let that power go to his head. Now, at this moment, Joseph's 40, 41, somewhere in that range, and old dad, Jacob, is about 130. But then in chapter 48, I guess if I was 130, I'd be wondering if I'm going to be here tomorrow too. But Jacob goes to Joseph's sons and gives them a blessing. And this is one of the ironies in this whole story. He gives the younger son the firstborn's blessing. And Joseph tries to correct him. He says, no, I know what I'm doing. I'm 130 years old, but I'm not stupid. I know what I'm doing. And he gave the younger son the blessing. Then in chapter 49, Jacob calls his boys together to give their blessings. And some of them blessings weren't so great. But that whole chapter deals with him doling out the blessings to his children. In chapter 50, well, in the end of chapter 49, Jacob dies. Now, 17 years have gone by, because he's about 147 or so when he dies. And like I said, all the numbers about age is just kind of an approximation. I just tried to pick an average, because you read one thing or another. But he's 147, 48, somewhere in that range, and he dies. After giving his sons the blessing, he dies. But he's made them sons promise him, when I die, don't put me in a hole in Egypt. Take me home to Canaan and bury me. So Joseph goes to Pharaoh and asks permission to take his daddy back to Canaan and bury him. Now that scene to me says a whole lot about Joseph. Now he's a powerful man. He's 40 years old, 41, 42, maybe 45 by now. He's a powerful man. But he humbles himself, and he goes to Pharaoh and says, hey, my dad made us promise to take him home and bury him. Is it okay if we do that? And Pharaoh's already told Joseph, do whatever you want to do. Take care of everything. But Joseph says, no, I'm going to go ask Pharaoh if it's okay. And of course, Pharaoh just heaps a blessing on him and sends a whole entourage with him. But as powerful as Joseph was, he knew it was only right that he asked if it was okay if he went. He was showing respect. And Pharaoh turned that respect right back around and showed his respect for Joseph and for Jacob by sending chariots and horsemen, his household servants. That had to be the ultimate funeral procession. So they go back to Canaan and they bury Dad. Then they come back to Egypt, the whole bunch of them. Now there's a scene in there In that chapter, where them boys are wondering, now that Dad's gone, he's going to get us. He's going to get payback. Because Daddy's not there anymore to protect us. And Joseph's he's going to get his revenge. I got to get my clicker, sorry. Knew I was going to forget that. They're feeling guilty. They've been dealing with guilt for now probably 30 years. And I found 2 quotes. A guilty conscience flees when no one pursues. And the one on the bottom is the one I really like. Our suspicions are a reflection of our own hearts. What was in those boys' minds was what they would do if they were in Joseph's shoes. They were scared to death that Joseph was going to treat them like they treated him. And Joseph was a bigger man than that. He was a bigger man than that. Those boys had forgot what he told them when he first revealed who he was. He made a couple of statements, and then he made another statement in chapter 50. But when they had first met, before all the hugging and weeping and crying, when he says, hey, I'm Joseph, your brother. In 45:5 it says, don't be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me. For God sent me here to preserve your life. And then in 3 verses later he said, it was not you who sent me here, but God. Now that takes a big man to make those 2 statements. Joseph was a man of faith. And then to those boys' fear that he's going to get them after Dad's gone, he says, you meant evil against me. And that's an understatement. Duh. They were going to kill him. You meant evil against me, and God meant it for good. So don't be afraid. If I was going to hurt you, I'd already done it. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Joseph is telling those boys, and he's telling us through the words that Moses wrote, God had a plan. And Joseph was a pawn in that plan, and those boys were too. God had a plan to save the Israelite nation. And that was all, they were all part of that plan. Now, the story ends in chapter 50. And Joseph dies. But before he does, he makes the family, the brothers, promise that when God sets them free from Egypt, when they leave Egypt to go back to Canaan, to take his bones with them. Now, when Jacob died, he made them promise, you take my body back and bury my body. And Joseph is saying, just take my bones, because it may be a while before this happens. Take my bones, but you have to promise me that when God gets you out of Egypt, you take my bones and bury them in Canaan. I think Joseph had some kind of insight into what was going to happen after Pharaoh died that knew Joseph. And things were probably already changing in Egypt, because by this time the famine's pretty much over, if it's not over totally, and things are getting back to normal. That command from Joseph to take his bones back was fulfilled 360 years later when Moses walked them out of Egypt. They had Joseph's bones with them. 360 years later, his family knew that Joseph had told them to take my bones out. Now, I don't know how many generations that is, but that was handed down from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next. And to give some perspective to that 360 years, the United States will be 250 years old in 26. So our whole country is not as old as that length of time. But Moses fulfilled that command. Joseph knew at the end of his life that the Israelites would not spend the rest of their life in Egypt. And I don't know how many Israelites there were when Joseph died, but they must have been multiplying pretty fast, because it was a huge number of people that Moses took out of there. Hebrews 11:22 tells us that Joseph had faith. Joseph had faith, real faith. So, our lesson today, now that I'm through with last week, our lesson today is, and I got Crystal to put in the email update, similarities. I thought this was interesting, so I wanted to do it. Similarities between Joseph and Jesus. And we're going to jump through these pretty quick. Both were rejected by their family. Now, if you don't want to write all this down and you want a copy of it, just let me know. Rejected by their family, they both were. They both predicted their future glory. Joseph through the dreams, and Jesus through, I'm coming back in glory. They both were unjustly punished. I'm having word trouble today. Unjustly punished. Neither one of them did what they were accused and punished for. They were both sold for silver. I never made that connection. Joseph sold for 20 pieces. Jesus sold for 30. Both of them were servants. Both of them were servants. Both of them were tempted. You know, when we think of the temptation that Joseph had, everybody just jumps to Potiphar's wife. How about the temptation to use that power that he had in the wrong way? I mean, he's like 40 years old, and he's the second most powerful man. A lot of people can't handle that. They'd be tempted to do things that they shouldn't do. Abuse that power. I mean, we see that today everywhere. That was a strong temptation, I'm sure. No mention of it. But it had to be. He was human. Falsely accused. Like I said, neither one of them did what they were accused of. Neither one of them made any defense. I always wondered why Joseph didn't say, "Hey man, I didn't touch that wife. I wouldn't anyway." And I really don't believe that Potiphar thought he did. We talked about that last week. They both had compassion. And they showed it in so many ways. Joseph took care of people that were starving to death. And Jesus gave us the bread of life. That's the next one. Both had their robes taken away. Jesus was mocked. You know, they put some robe on him. They done beat him half to death. So they put some fancy robe on him, mocking him. Well, that blood off his back where they had beat him, I'm sure it was all over that robe. And of course, the boys took Joseph's robe back to Dad after they took it off of him, throwed the goat blood on it. So both of them had robes taken away, and both of them had blood on them robes. Both of them were placed with two prisoners. Joseph with the cupbearer and the baker, the bad food day. Jesus with the two guys on the cross. And the irony is that in both cases, one was saved and one was not. I'd never thought about that. Both of them started their true work at 30. Both of them forgave people that wronged them. Both of them. And both of them turned man's wrongdoing, what people did to them, into God's purpose. So that's just some of the similarities. I'm sure there's plenty more of them, but that's just some of them. So, some things we can learn from Joseph's life. When life seems unfair, and it will, and when trials and troubles come, and they will, and when life just seems to keep knocking us down over and over, our response says a lot about our faith. The level of our faith, the maturity of our faith. And that's how Joseph handled what happened to him so well, is he was a man of faith. He had real faith. Now, Psalms 56:3 says, "When I'm afraid, I put my trust in you." Boy, that's easy to read. When I'm afraid, I trust you. The question is, do we really? Do we really? And I put be honest, because that's hard. It used to be people put bumper stickers on their cars. Now they don't have a bumper, so I guess you just stick it on the windshield or something. Used to be a bumper sticker that said, "Let go, let God." Let go, let God. That's 4 words. That's really hard to do. That's what Joseph did, though. That boy rolled with the punches. He trusts God. Joseph trusts God, no matter what. And that's hard. That's hard. That takes real faith and real commitment. We all have times when we think, why is this happening to me? Have I done something? I've had that thought. We sing a song sometimes farther along. In the first verse of that song, it says, "Tempted and tried, we're oft made to wonder why it should be thus all the day long. Others are living about us, never molested, though in the wrong." And we're in that song, in that verse of that song, we're asking, hey, them people's worse than me. Why is this happening to me? And they're not getting it. Joseph didn't have those thoughts. He trusted God. Scripture says the rain falls on the just and the unjust. God's not a respecter of persons. He doesn't punish us with troubles either. We inflict a lot of punishment on ourselves with our actions. And it's clear, crystal clear, that in the story of Joseph, it says it in several places. God was with him. It says that in several verses. In this, God was with him. it's hard for us to realize that God is always present in our lives. But that's the message of the Bible. God's constant presence in our lives. And when things get hard, and they will, boy, life's tough, we need to remember Hebrews 13, 5, and 6, which basically says, God will never leave us nor forsake us, turn his back on us. He'll never do that. Never. And we talked about last week, when God says something, he does it. He does it. And if God says that, he's going to do it. Matthew 28:20 says, I am with you always. There's times when I wish he wasn't. Or at least I think he doesn't need to be looking. God is with us always. So, I got about 10 minutes. 6 things that we can learn from Joseph. God's plans are bigger than our understanding. Because we got these little pea brains. We think we know it all. God's plans are bigger than we can ever possibly imagine. Isaiah 55, 8 and 9 is very familiar. My ways are higher than yours, and my thoughts are higher than yours. Basically, in that verse, God's saying, remember your place. I'm God, you're not. Number 2, God provides for us and blesses us if we'll persevere. That's a hard word for me to say. Persevere and trust him. He's promised us that. And like I said a while ago, if God promises you something, you can take it to the bank. It's going to happen. He provides for and blesses the people that trust him and hang in there. Hang in there. What do you think would happen to Joseph's life if he had took advantage of Potiphar's wife's advances? I don't think it would have turned out like it did. God would have taken care of the Israelites either way. It's kind of like Mordecai told Esther, if you choose not to do this, God's still going to save the Israelites. It doesn't depend totally on you, but you're going to play a role in it. Joseph believed that God would take care of him. And then number 3, boy, that's tough. That's a bad one there. God can use the most painful thing that happens in your life for good. Boy, that's tough. I've told it before in here, but our former minister, Ross, they lost his granddaughter quickly. Like in 7 or 8 days, she went from happy running around little girl to her funeral. She was 8 years old. That's a man that's been preaching for almost 50 years now. His daughter and her husband, absolutely wonderful couple. Things like that happen in life. But the Bible says God can take that kind of thing and turn it into something good. Now the mom, Heather, she helps people that are going through the same thing. It's like a breast cancer person can help another breast cancer person. Somebody that's been through this kind of trial can help somebody that's going through the same kind of trial. And that's turning something bad into something good. God can take the hardest thing that you deal with and eventually turn it into something good. Because Romans 8:28 says that. God works all things together for good for those that love Him. So, in some ways, the ball's in our court. It requires our love, it requires our trust, and it requires our perseverance. If things turn bad and we say, I'm through with God, He still loves you, but He's not going to force you to love Him. Number 4, there is real value in living with self-control, especially in the society that we live in. But Joseph's society was absolutely horrible too. We live in a society that says nothing's wrong. If you think it's okay, it's okay. There's no real truth. That's what they teach today. There's no real truth. Self-control is a defensive thing. Proverbs says a man with no self-control is like a fortress with no walls. You got no defense. That's what self-control does for us. And it's a valuable thing. And we need that in our lives. Joseph had that in his life. His life was in one sense out of his control, but the way he handled it was in his control. And he handled it well. And God helped him handle it. 1 Peter 4:7 says, be self-controlled and sober-minded. I don't say sober-minded, I just say have a little common sense. I think that's what he's trying to say in that verse. Have a little common sense. And as the cliche says, common sense is not so common anymore. But have a little common sense and control yourself. People say, I can't help myself. Come on, give me a break. You going to tell God that on Judgment Day? I couldn't help it, God. It's just the way you made me. You better have something better than that. Number 5, God honors patience and perseverance. We already talked about that. He'll bless you if you hang in there. You know, Psalms 46:10 says, be still and know that I'm God. Know that I'm God. And number 6, honesty and a strong work ethic are very important in our life. Now, how do you think Joseph got to be over Potiphar's house in the first place? I mean, Potiphar buys him off of a slave trader. I mean, we read a couple of verses and boom, Joseph is in charge of Potiphar's whole estate. And Potiphar trusts him. Take care of it. Don't come bothering me about stuff. Take care of it. And then, of course, things turn sour. He goes to jail. Guess what? Read a couple of verses. And who's working for the warden now, in charge of all the prisoners? Joseph. How do you think that happened? And then Pharaoh says, tell me what this dream means. And Joseph tells him, God's, you know, this is what God's going to do. This is what God's trying to tell you. And he outlines what needs to be done. How do you think Joseph figured out what needed to be done? I mean, he's this little spoiled, little 17-year-old boy that had never worked a day in his life, probably when he was sold. I mean, he was daddy's little boy. Had his fancy coat. He sure wasn't going to wear that to work. How do you learn how to manage something as big as distribution for food for basically the whole known world at that time? How did he do that? He had a strong work ethic. And he was honest. And if you know anybody that runs a business, or anybody that manages a business, or anybody that's trying to hire an employee today, those two qualities are very scarce. Years ago, the guy in Palmetto, where we came from, opened a Dairy Queen. He hired 50-something people before he found 10 good ones. And that was 25 years ago. I can't imagine trying to run a business now. Honesty and a strong work ethic helped Joseph in so many ways. And he proved himself honest. And he proved himself to have a good work ethic. Joseph's story teaches us so many things that we can use in our lives today. The principles that are taught in the Bible, displayed through the lives of people we study in the Bible, are timeless. They applied to people then as well as they apply to people now. Because thousands of years have passed, but people are still people. And human nature is the same today as it was 1,000 years ago, and it'll be the same in 1,000 more years if Jesus don't come back. Human nature is human nature. And we deal with the same temptations, we deal with the same stuff these people did. In different ways, but the same basic things. So Scripture is timeless, and the teachings of Scripture are timeless. We can apply them today just as well as they did then. And we can put our trust in the same God that Joseph trusted. The God that saved Noah, the God that guided Abraham, the God that empowered Moses and sent Jesus to save us. God loves us, God's with us, and God will never leave us. And if that don't make you love Him, you need to keep reading. God's got your back, so to speak. And He'll guide your life if you'll let Him, because it's all in that book. Scripture says it's all there. Everything we need is in this book. But it's up to us. He's not going to crack our head and put it in there. It's up to us to study it and learn it and apply it. Next week, Lord willing, and Jimmy don't change his mind, our lesson will be the favored son and the hated brother. That's it.